All right, remember that today we are going to turn directly to the text of The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus, which we painted in its broad structure last class. And to remind you of this structure, let's bear in mind some of these major elements. First of all, that like with Nietzsche, the problem is nihilism. Okay? Or the view that life is utterly meaningless. Now, the closest figure to Camus we've considered is Nietzsche. And although Nietzsche maintains that nothing has inherent value, and that value judgments are really just matters of perspective. For example, the master versus the slave perspective. For Nietzsche, nihilism is the problem to be overcome, and we can overcome nihilism by creating. And what we create, most of all, is ourselves. And this entails coming to know who we are. In an ontological sense, the will to power. And since the will to power is essentially a principle of universal creativity, then to become what we already are, the will to power, is to be creative. And no matter what it is that we create, materially speaking, the path we choose in life, what is being created is the revelation of the will to power. We create ourselves through our creative willing. Okay? So for Nietzsche, I can say no to nihilism and say yes to life. Okay? But for Camus, if I either pretend that nihilism is false, or I pretend that by willing my life to have a meaning through, for example, the Kierkegaardian leap of faith, then I have committed what Camus calls philosophical suicide. Because I have destroyed the only possibility that exists for giving my life value. And giving life value does not mean the same thing as giving it meaning. To say that I can give my life a meaning by doing this or that, or subscribing to some interpretation of human existence that makes it all right, and in terms of which I can understand my suffering. To do so is to reconcile myself to my life. But according to Camus, to reconcile oneself to life, such as we do when we say, my life is justified if I can only achieve happiness or virtue or be a caring person or render my will good by proceeding from my duty to respect the moral law. In each case, what I have done is set up some value equation, good means X, Y, or Z, within which I must live my life. This sets up parameters or a sort of zone within which I must remain, lest my life become meaningless. But for Camus, nothing ultimately matters. The major milestones, which culture generally regards as constituting a full, meaningful life, are no more meaningful than everyday gestures, like taking a shower, tying my shoe. Because if nothing ultimately matters, then despite the judgment I make, no one activity can mean anything more than any other activity. Thus, to give life value ultimately means substituting the quantity of my life experience for the quality of experience. For Camus, I cannot say something like, so long as I have had one or two moments of significant meaning, then I am justified in my existence. Because if nothing matters, then it doesn't matter what I do. Thus, the point is to pack as much experience into your life as possible. Okay? But the rub is that I do so knowing all along that nothing I do amounts to anything. And therein is the meaning of revolt. Life is absurd. Meaning what? That we exist with the will to meaning. Or perhaps what Nietzsche called the will to power. And yet, there is no meaning which can justify the suffering which life inescapably is. So there is a logic to the absurd, and it is the confrontation between human need, the need for meaning, and the silence of the world. I look to the world. I look even to my own reasoning for an answer about what can make life worth living, and I am met with silence. Okay? So the confrontation of human need and world silence gives rise to the absurd. Notice that life is absurd does not simply mean that it is meaningless, because until we will a meaning, even for the existential thinkers, life remains unjustified. And so the existentialists prescribe the establishment of meaning through either something like Nietzschean creation or Kierkegaardian leap of faith or Viktor Frankl's will to meaning, okay? But for Camus, the only way to move beyond nihilism, which of course does not mean the same thing as negating nihilism, is to revolt against the absurd. But to revolt against the absurd requires keeping the absurd alive, which means I cannot cancel out either of its terms. Again, the terms of the equation of the absurd are that we have a need to reduce the world to a simple, complete principle which explains everything. And the impossibility of doing so. That is the absurd. It is a tension. It has two terms, two poles. And if I cancel either one of them, for example, if I make a leap of faith and convince myself that life is worth living so long as I am passionate and true to the God of my understanding, then I have found some redemption. But for Camus, not only can I cancel the absurd or pretend like the absurd does not exist by providing a meaning to life, okay, which cancels out the world's silence, I can also pretend like I just don't care. If I try to talk myself into believing that I am simply going to live for the day, seize every opportunity possible, strive for as much pleasure as I can, and I don't care if I leave any lasting mark on the world, then I have canceled out my human need. And that itself is a self-deception. Because to be human is to have that need for meaning in the face of the impossibility of establishing one. And that is what Kierkegaard meant by saying that one cannot escape human subjectivity. Okay? So in the end, Camus says that nihilism is really not the enemy, as it seems Nietzsche to be saying. Rather, nihilism, the very fact that life is meaningless and that we will for it to have meaning, provides us the only opportunity for rising above nihilism, not canceling it. I must admit that life is nihilistic in order, through a shift in my consciousness, to rise above it. And I rise above nihilism simply by revolting against the absurd. Essentially, this means looking life directly in the face and saying, I know that nothing I do matters, that my life is a tale told by a fool, signifying nothing. And yet, I am going to live anyway. I'm going to do as much as I can possibly do, because there is nothing that can parallel the grandeur, the magnificence, of the sight of human pride when there is, in reality, nothing to be proud about. For Camus, giving life meaning, I should say, giving life value, is to will life in the face of the lack of any justification for doing so. Life means nothing, yet I choose to live it anyway. Why? Because I can. It is essentially laughing along with the cosmic joke perpetrated on humanity by instilling in us the care about our own fate when it is impossible for us to establish any meaning for our individual lives. But all of this comes down simply to a shift in consciousness. Okay? It is not what I do that matters. It is that I do something, and that I do it with the recognition that it means nothing. And in so doing, I become larger, greater than my fate. Okay? And so, in the end, what from the beginning seemed like an invitation to death or suicide becomes a rule for living. I live. I will to live, unreconciled to my life, for nothing other than the pure flame of living itself. Not living as this or that, but simply living in the absence of a reason that justifies it. Okay? And that's what he means by revolt against the absurd, or defiance. We are to be defiant in the face of life's meaninglessness. Okay? This amounts to substituting the quantity of experiences for the quality, since no one activity can possibly mean anything. That means that nothing can mean anything more than anything else. So the practical way of living the absurd life is to do as much as I possibly can. Okay? Without needing a justification for doing so. So let's take a look at the text, okay? In the preface, Camus writes, the fundamental subject of the myth of Sisyphus is this: it is legitimate and necessary to wonder whether life has a meaning. Therefore, it is legitimate to meet the problem of suicide face to face. The answer, underlying and appearing through the paradoxes which cover it, is this: even if one does not believe in God, suicide is not legitimate. Okay? All right. Actually, that was the translator's preface. So here's Camus. And the first section is called An Absurd Reasoning. Subtitle: Absurdity and Suicide. And this is where he writes the famous line, there is but only one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether or not life is worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy, while all the rest, for example, whether or not the world has 3 dimensions, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, these come afterward, and they are games, because one must first answer for the justification of living at all. Okay? Okay. At the bottom of the next page, second paragraph, he writes this: suicide has never been dealt with except as a social phenomenon. Now you tell me, why is it that we can publicly only deal with suicide as a public phenomenon?
Because it's inspiring people.
Right, because it is something one must do alone. The reasons for a suicide are never definitive. And the pathway to suicide is one that we travel by ourselves. Okay? On the contrary, we are here concerned at the outset with the relationship between individual thought and suicide. Now, an act like this is prepared within the silence of the heart, as is a great work of art. The man himself is ignorant of it. One evening he pulls the trigger, or jumps. Of an apartment building manager who had killed himself, I was told that he had lost his daughter 5 years before, that he had changed greatly since, and that experience had undermined him. A more exact word cannot be imagined. Beginning to think is beginning to be undermined. What does that mean, to be undermined? Think about having the rug pulled out from beneath your feet, the ground beneath your feet destroyed, the temples that we build in order to give our lives meaning, the ground that we stand on, which gets us from day to day. These begin to crumble, thereby undermining us as soon as we begin really to think about the why exist rather than not exist. Almost sounds like Hamlet's question, to be or not to be. That's the question. Okay. Now, there are many causes for a suicide, and generally the most obvious ones were not the most powerful. Rarely is suicide committed through reflection. What do you mean by this? You may find a suicide note, but you typically do not find a pro and con list for living. Okay? It's not as if somebody does the calculations and comes up with the conclusion that they ought to commit suicide. What sets off the crisis is almost always unverifiable. Newspapers often speak of personal sorrows or of incurable illness. Sure, these explanations are plausible, but one would have to know whether a friend of the desperate man had not that very day addressed him indifferently. He is the guilty one, for that is enough to precipitate all the rancors and all the boredom still in suspension. So, what do you think that segment is describing? Imagine a man dying of an incurable illness, in constant pain, and yet he has a friend who passes by him every day and stops and has a little chat, exchanges pleasantries with him. And this simple thing gives the man something to look forward to each day. But then on one day, perhaps for no reason at all, maybe simply the man has something else on his mind, he passes right by him without saying hello. Doesn't mean anything by it, he just does it. But that could be the straw that broke the camel's back. And you never know when that straw is going to be placed on your shoulders. And it's at that moment when what Camus calls all the rancor, which is hatred, and the boredom of everyday life comes tumbling down upon us. Because up until that point, we had found some way to hold that rancor and boredom in suspension. I think about it like a big net above our heads, and each string comprising this net is something that helps us get through life, something meaningful to us. But little by little, these strings get cut, and you never know when you are about to cut the final string holding back all of that boredom and rancor and suffering. At which point, all of it precipitates upon us. Okay? A little further down, he writes, in a sense, and as in a melodrama, killing yourself amounts to confessing. It is confessing that life is too much for you, or that you don't understand it. But let's not go too far in such analogies, however, but rather return to everyday words. It is merely confessing that life is not worth the trouble. Living, naturally, is never easy. You continue making the gestures commanded by existence for many reasons, the first of which is habit. Dying voluntarily implies that you have recognized, even instinctively, the ridiculous character of that habit, the absence of any profound reason for living, the insane character of that daily agitation, and the uselessness of suffering. Now you see, a world that can be explained even with bad reason is a familiar world. But on the other hand, in a universe suddenly divested of illusions and lights, man feels an alien, a stranger. And if you haven't read Albert Camus' The Stranger, I highly recommend it. Okay, it's a book about the utter meaninglessness of life from the perspective of the protagonist who commits an absolutely senseless murder for no reason whatsoever, because he himself feels a stranger in this world. Okay? And so he writes, the subject of this essay is precisely this relationship between the absurd and suicide, the exact degree to which suicide is a solution to the absurd. And of course, we know in advance that for Camus, suicide is not an answer to the absurd. Suicide is a renunciation of life. It is saying no to life. Okay? Living the absurd life, remaining unreconciled to it unto my death, finding value, requires that I do not renounce my life. I say yes to my life despite the fact that there is nothing to say yes to. Okay? All right, now in the section called Absurd Walls, he's talking about the walls that we erect to give the world a sense of familiarity, like the set on a theatrical stage. It isn't real. It is hollow, artificial, and yet we go through life building these stage sets to convince us that we belong here, that there is familiarity and intelligibility regarding my place in the world. But he writes at the bottom here on page 7 out of the 35 pages that at any street corner, the feeling of absurdity can arise. It can strike any man in the face. As it is, in its distressing nudity, in its light without effulgence, it is elusive. What do you suppose he means by the light of absurdity, yet a light without effulgence? Well, effulgence is the actual illumination, okay, the lighting up. But what gets lit up by the absurd is nothing bright. It is sort of the showing of the dark side of life. Okay? It is probably true that a man remains forever unknown to us, and that there is in him something irreducible that escapes us. But practically, I can know men and recognize them by their behavior, by the totality of their deeds, by the consequences caused in life by their presence. Okay, so that sounds a lot like Sartre. Okay, so there are some existential elements here. Although, as we will see, Camus disagrees with the existential move of creating a meaning. He calls that philosophical suicide. Why is the creation of a value equation, like saying the good life means happiness or virtue or duty, philosophical suicide? Because as soon as I subscribe to some interpretation that makes life worthwhile or meaningful, I have destroyed the only possibility available to me for giving life meaning, which is revolt. To revolt against the absurd requires keeping the absurd alive. And keeping the absurd alive requires maintaining the world's silence that meets my need or will to meaning. Okay? Now on page 8, he writes, all great deeds and all great thoughts have a ridiculous beginning. What do you suppose he means by that? I kind of think about, this story, true or not, about Isaac Newton sitting underneath an apple tree. The apple falls on his head, which is the catalyst for his calculating the laws of gravitation, right? A ridiculous action, like an apple falling on your head, spawning such a world-altering understanding of things, okay? Well, the absurd is the same way for Camus. Great works are often born on a street corner or in a restaurant's revolving door. And so it is with the absurd. The absurd world, more than others, derives its nobility from that abject birth. In certain situations, replying nothing when asked what one is thinking about may be pretense in a man. Those who are loved are well aware of this, right? If I ask my 16-year-old, hey, what's bugging you? He said, nothing. Well, he's probably pretending. There probably is something bothering him, but he just doesn't want to talk about it. However, if that reply is sincere, if it symbolizes that odd state of soul in which the void becomes eloquent, in which the chain of daily gestures is broken, in which the heart vainly seeks the link that will connect it again, then it is, as it were, the first signs of absurdity. So if you ask me, hey, what's up? What are you thinking about? And I say nothing, and I mean it, I am thinking nothingness. That is the first sign of absurdity rearing its head. And I say that all the time. People ask me, what the heck are you thinking about? You seem to be off in space. And if I say I'm not thinking about anything, you better believe that I am serious. There's nothing going on up there. I'm thinking nothing. Okay? So he goes on. It happens that the stage sets collapse, right? The stage sets, the artifice that we've built up around us to give the world a sense of familiarity. Rising, streetcar, 4 hours in the office or at the factory, meal, streetcar, 4 hours of work, meal, sleep, and Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, according to the same rhythm. This path is easily followed most of the time. But one day, the why arises. Why am I doing these things? Why do anything? and everything begins in that weariness tinged with amazement. What follows is the gradual return into the chain, right? The flight back into the anonymity of the everyday world of non-reflection. Or it is the definitive awakening. And at the end of the awakening comes in time the consequence, either suicide or recovery. Now, recovery cannot mean return into the daily gestures, the routines of familiarity. We take the absurd on face to face and either admit that we cannot handle it and kill ourselves, or we will to revolt against the absurd, which is what I think he means by recovery. Likewise, and during every day of an unillustrious life, time carries us. All right, what does he mean by that? During your everyday, time carries you along. Well, I can see it right here in front of you. Okay, some of you, you're carrying bags. Some of you are wearing work uniforms, right? We have obligations. We live on clock time, from appointment to appointment. Martin Heidegger wrote that everyday existence temporalizes time from coffee break to coffee break. Okay? But a moment always comes when we have to carry it. Time. It can no longer carry us along because we realize that we've been carried along by artifice, meaninglessness. We live on the future. Tomorrow, later on, when you have made your way, or you will understand when you are old enough. Right? These are all the things we say to young people who aren't ready to understand adulthood, or perhaps the horrifying truth of absurdity. And such irrelevancies, like you'll understand someday, are wonderful. Why? After all, it's a matter of dying. If I can't for some time accept these irrelevancies, then I am already very close to suicide. Yet a day comes when a man notices or says that he is 30 years old. Thus, he asserts his youth. Okay, hey, I'm 30, but 30 is young. Okay? But simultaneously, he situates himself in a relationship to time. He takes his place in it. He admits that he stands on a certain point on a curve that he acknowledges having to travel to its end. He belongs to time. And by the horror that seizes him, he recognizes his worst enemy. Tomorrow. Tomorrow is our worst enemy. But he was living for tomorrow, whereas everything in him ought to reject it. That revolt of the flesh is the absurd. Okay, so here we're talking about the way that the absurd manifests itself. He's trying to give us a feeling of this absurdity, to evoke a sense of it. Because it's not an intellectual thing, mind you. He's already said, rarely does a suicide result through rational reflection. Okay? But think about the idea that we live on tomorrow. Right? When you're 7, 8, 9 years old, you're looking forward to being 10. Hey, I've made double digits. You're 10, then you're looking toward 13 because you're a teenager. Then 16, when you can drive. 18, you're emancipated. 21, you can go into bars and drink legally. Maybe even 25, because that sort of is that's sort of beginning to pass into adulthood. Maybe even 30, because that truly is a milestone that separates, being 20-something from being 30-something. So we live for these future milestones. They beckon us to keep going. But in reality, they ought to be our worst enemy, because they are the future. And every single day that passes brings me a step closer to my death, whenever that is. And I don't know when it is. Okay? Now a step lower, and strangeness creeps in. Perceiving that the world is dense, sensing to what a degree a stone is foreign and irreducible to us, with what intensity nature or a landscape can negate us. At the heart of all beauty lies something inhuman, and these hills, the softness of the sky, the outline of these trees at this very minute lose the illusory meaning with which we had clothed them. Henceforth more remote than a lost paradise. Okay, so what does he mean by saying that the world or nature in an instant can negate us? Let's say you're laying on a beach somewhere, right? And hey, I'm on my vacation, and I've got people bringing me nice little fruity cocktails and eating lobster and laying in the sun, and the water's calm, and I feel like I've made it. I've got the world at my fingertips, and then a tsunami hits, and suddenly the world becomes itself again. The primitive hostility of the world, of the earth. Think about the earth in its early days, when it was still molten. How molten lava consumes everything in its path. Or go stand at the edge of the Grand Canyon and feel your own relative insignificance. Okay? Well, nothing has changed about the world. What has changed is something in your consciousness. The world hasn't changed. It has simply shown its true face. You cannot reason with a rock. There's no reasoning with a hurricane. It doesn't care about us. We are strangers in this natural world. Okay? The primitive hostility of the world rises up to face us across millennia. And for a second, we cease to understand it, because for centuries we have understood it solely under the images and designs that we had attributed to it beforehand. Because henceforth we lack the power to make use of that artifice. The world evades us because it becomes itself again. that stage scenery, masked by habit, becomes again what it is. It withdraws at a distance from us. Just as there are days when under the familiar face of a woman we see as a stranger her we had loved months or years ago, perhaps we shall come even to desire what suddenly leaves us so alone. But the time has not yet come. Just one thing, that denseness of the world and that strangeness of the world is the absurd. And men too secrete the absurd. At certain moments of lucidity, the mechanical aspect of their gestures, their meaningless pantomime, makes silly everything that surrounds them. Picture this. A man is talking on a telephone behind a glass partition, okay? Let's say your boss. You cannot hear him, but you see his incomprehensible, dumb show, right? You imagine him with his feet up on his desk, leaned back in his chair, talking all self-important, making it look like, what he's saying is the most important thing in the world. You wonder why he is alive. Why? It's all meaningless. This discomfort in the face of man's own inhumanity, this incalculable tumble before the image of what we are, this nausea, as a writer of today calls it, Sartre, by the way, is also the absurd. Likewise, the stranger who at certain seconds comes to meet us in a mirror, the familiar and yet alarming brother we encounter in our own photographs, is also the absurd. Okay? So are you beginning to get a sense of what he means by the absurd here? The denseness of the world, the stranger in the mirror, man's own inhumanity, the strangeness of your loved one. Did you ever look in the mirror and for a moment it's as if you're looking at somebody else? Or you look at a picture of yourself, maybe a picture of yourself as a child. You know it's you, but it's as if you're looking at an entirely different person. There's a strangeness and absurdity about it that can only be felt. And near the bottom of page 9, he writes, all the pretty speeches about the soul will have their contrary convincingly proved, at least for a time, from this inert body on which a slap makes no mark. The soul has disappeared. What's he talking about? A dead body. Okay? The elementary and definitive aspect of the adventure constitutes the absurd feeling. Under the fatal lighting of that destiny, its uselessness becomes evident. No code of ethics and no effort is justifiable a priori in the face of the cruel mathematics that command our condition. There's nothing you can do. You cannot say that I am justified as long as I am happy, or as long as my actions proceed from duty, or so long as I do the will of God, or I care for people, or I maximize happiness. Because the math doesn't add up. None of it means anything. But he reminds us, I am interested not so much in absurd discoveries as in their consequences. If one is assured of these facts, that life ultimately is absurd, what is one to conclude? How far is one willing to go to elude nothing? Because that is what we are running from when we mask the world in artifice to make us feel at home. How much energy, how much self-deception am I willing to put forth in order to run away from absolutely nothing? Because notice, the anxiety we feel in the face of the absurd does not have an object. It's not like being afraid of a tiger or an imminent threat. It is a feeling of absurdity, which we desperately want to avoid. Because if we do not avoid it, then the only choices are revolt or suicide. Whatever may be the plays on words and the acrobatics of logic, to understand is, above all, to unify. The mind's deepest desire, even in its most elaborate operations, parallels man's unconscious feeling in the face of his universe. It is an insistence upon familiarity and an appetite for clarity. Understanding the world for a man is reducing it to the human, stamping it with his seal, right? When we calculate the laws of physics, we predict the weather, we create things, we defy gravity by putting airplanes in the sky. And so we stamp nature with our approval as if we have power over it, when at any moment it can consume us, when it shows its true face again, when that magnificent airliner is ripped into pieces by the wind. Okay? Now on page 12, he writes this. I said that the world is absurd, but I was too hasty. This world in itself is not reasonable. That is all that can be said. But what is absurd is the confrontation of this irrational and the wild longing for clarity, whose call echoes in the human heart. The absurd depends as much on man as on the world. For the moment, it is all that links them together. It binds them one to the other, as only hatred can weld two creatures together. On page... Did I go the wrong way? I did. He writes, I must sacrifice everything to these certainties, and I must see them squarely to be able to maintain them. Above all, I must adapt my behavior to them, and pursue them in all their consequences. I am speaking here of decency, but I want to know beforehand if thought can live in those deserts. Can thought live in the desert of meaninglessness? And his answer is yes. And here on page 16, he writes, the absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. Okay? Remember that. That's a nice, concise statement of the equation of absurdity. And this is answer 17. And carrying this absurd logic to its conclusion, I must admit that the struggle implies a total absence of hope, which has nothing to do with despair, right? Just because you don't have hope doesn't mean you must despair. A continual rejection, which must not be confused with renunciation. I can reject my life but not renounce it. And a conscious dissatisfaction, which must not be compared to immature unrest. Everything that destroys, conjures away, or exorcises these requirements ruins the absurd and devalues the attitude that may then be proposed. The absurd has meaning only insofar as it is not agreed to. Now notice this on 18. He says, now to limit myself to existential philosophies, I see that all of them, without exception, suggest escape. Tell me, what do existential philosophies seek to escape? Why does Kierkegaard make the leap of faith? To escape the meaninglessness of life, which, according to Camus, we all know to be the case. Okay? He writes, Kierkegaard wants to be cured. To be cured is his frenzied wish, and it runs throughout his whole journal. And so I am taking the liberty at this point of calling the existential attitude philosophical suicide. Why is it philosophical suicide? Because I'm not actually taking my life, but if I become an existentialist, make the leap of faith, then I have given my freedom to revolt against the absurd, over to an interpretation of life that makes it all right. Camus' entire point is that it is not all right. And only if we can admit that it is not all right and yet will to live anyway is it ever going to be possible for us to be greater than our fate to a nihilistic existence. On page 27, he writes, there can be no question of masking the evidence, of suppressing the absurd by denying one of its terms, right? Human need and world silence. It is essential to know whether one can live with it or whether, on the other hand, logic commands one to die of it. But I'm not interested in philosophical suicide, but rather in plain suicide. Now, this is very important. Listen to the following on page 27, right-hand side, in the section called Absurd Freedom. I don't know whether this world has a meaning that transcends it. But I know that I do not know that meaning, and that it is impossible for me just now to know it. What can a meaning outside my own condition mean to me? I can understand only in human terms. What I touch, what resists me, that is what I understand. And these two certainties, my appetite for the absolute and for unity, and, on the other hand, the impossibility of reducing this world to a rational and reasonable principle. Again, human need and world silence. See, if I were a tree among trees or a cat among animals, this life would have a meaning. Or rather, this problem would not arise, because then I should belong to this world. I should be this world to which I am now opposed by my whole consciousness and by my whole insistence upon familiarity. And then on page 28 he writes, and it is with this that he is concerned. Man, he wants to find out if it is possible to live without appeal. Can I live without making appeal to Christianity or to my life's work or to my children or anything else that pretends to make life meaningful? Living is keeping the absurd alive. Keeping it alive is, above all, remaining conscious of it or contemplating it. Imagine this. It is at the extreme limit of the condemned man's last thought, that shoelace, that despite everything, he sees a few yards away on the very brink of his dizzying fall. The contrary of suicide, in fact, is the man condemned to die. He's condemned to die. He will have his life wrenched away from him, but not willingly. That revolt gives life its value. Spread out over the whole length of a life, it restores its majesty to that life. To a man devoid of blinders, there is no finer sight than that of the intelligence at grips with a reality that transcends it. The sight of human pride is unequaled. I understand, then, why the doctrines that explain everything to me, like what? Some religion, some science, also debilitate me. They relieve me of the weight of my own life, and yet I must carry it alone. So, consciousness and revolt, these rejections are the contrary of renunciation. Everything that is indomitable and passionate in a human heart quickens them, on the contrary, with its own life. It is essential to die unreconciled and not of one's own free will. The absurd is his extreme tension, which he maintains constantly by solitary effort, for he knows that in that consciousness and in that day-to-day revolt, he gives proof of his only truth, which is defiance revolt. That is a first consequence. Okay? All right. To speak clearly, to the extent to which I hope, to which I worry about a truth that might be individual to me, about a way of being or creating, to the extent to which I arrange my life and prove thereby that I accept its having a meaning, I create for myself barriers between which I must confine my life, which is what we've been doing all semester. If life means happiness, then I have to fall within the happiness range. If life means virtue, then I've got to hit the mean. Okay? If life means doing one's duty, then I must proceed from duty and not from inclination. But all of these value equations enslave me. They say I don't matter unless I do X, Y, or Z. Camus is saying I don't matter anyway. And so if you want to find value in your life, first you've got to be assured of that fact, and then revolt against it by willing to live without making appeal to any such artificial meaning. You see, when I live in privation of hope, when I lose hope for anything coming around the bend in the future to raise me up, to save me, when I look life square in the face and realize there is no redemption, that is when I really become available to my life. He gives us the image of a man on death row on the morning of his execution when the prison doors open and he's walking toward the electric chair. How divinely available he is to the pure flame of life, because nothing in that moment matters but life itself. Nothing to live for, just simply living. That's an increase in my availability. So living is keeping the absurd alive. Keeping it alive is above all contemplating it. Okay. And then on page 32, now, faced with this particular concern, belief in the absurd is tantamount to substituting the quantity of experience for the quality. Pack as much in as you can. It almost sounds like the Transcendentalists, Thoreau and Emerson, just suck the marrow out of life. Because nothing matters, so just live life to the fullest, as trite as that sounds. Okay? So he says, having started from an anguished awareness of the inhuman, the meditation on the absurd returns at the end of its itinerary to the very heart of the passionate flames of human revolt. Thus I draw from the absurd three consequences: my revolt, my freedom, and my passion. And by the mere activity of consciousness, I transform into a rule of life what was an invitation to death, and I refuse suicide.